Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Miguel, I'm the CTO of IVL Education. We are based in New York, and we build learning ecosystems on top of Open edX for Fortune 500 companies, universities, etc. And the idea is to use data, right, to make our learning ecosystems more intuitive for the learners, but also useful for the educators and for the administrators. So today we are going to be talking about skills, right, on the Open edX platform, which will follow an approach that is based on building outside of Open edX, right? It is leveraging what edX is good at and what edX has, alongside external systems, right, that are oriented towards the gathering of data, processing of data, and displaying it back to the end users. So we talk about skills, right, and it's kind of the buzzword right nowadays. And the thing is that so far, courses and programs have been what our platforms are based on, right? Everyone's like, we build programs, we build courses. The learner will go through the course and the program, and then we'll get a certificate for the course or the program, right? And that's been sort of the norm. Now, the problem is if you look at the learner's real incentives, right? At least especially when you're focused in the corporate sector or even in the professional education division of universities, etc. What really seems to matter is how well are you preparing me as a learner to get a job, right? Or to move up, or get a better job, or even retain my job, right? Basically, the correlation with the career advancement of the learner is what we find to be the most meaningful and the biggest driver of learner incentives to not only stay in the courses, but also take more, complete them, and so on, right? It's how closely are we aligning our programs with the learner's career advancements? How closely are we helping learners get a better job, okay? And if you as a learner are, let's say looking for a job in deep learning, it's great that you say, okay, so I've taken these deep learning fundamentals programs, but from the point of view of the employer, it's not really necessarily clear, okay, well, what skills have you earned, right? I mean, maybe you look at the syllabus of this program and you say, okay, so this program maybe teaches this, so I assume that if the learner has completed a certificate in this course and this course teaches this, then by the transitive property, maybe the learner has some skills. Okay, the loop is too far, right? So from the learner standpoint, we find that whenever we build a platform that ends up reaching, hundreds of thousands or millions of users, typically the alignment with the career incentives of the learner is strongest. Okay, if we don't really do a good job of that, right? If the courses are not really clearly designed to help learners advance their careers, then it's not a waste of time, right? Because learning is still interesting and so on, but it's no longer such a motivating thing, right, to finish the courses and to get the credentials and so on. Okay, so point is, from the learner standpoint, career advancement, skills, quantify progress in courses and in programs in order to convey to employers and to your professional network. Okay, now you see, what about from the standpoint of an instructor, right, or an educator? So an educator goes through the creation of programs and courses and so on in order to provide learners with these skills, right? We've been, maybe before COVID, we saw that maybe there were more universities and so on talking about, the love of learning. It's not really important how my course as a university instructor helps a learner get a job, because this was especially coming before COVID. The idea was that, as an instructor, it's not my job to help a learner with their career. It's just to advance education. Right now, especially because the universities, companies, etc., everybody is competing, right, for the time of the learner. You see that some of the nonsense gets cut out, right? So now more and more instructors start to buy into the idea that I really have to help my students get a job, which means I have to align what I'm teaching with the skills that I'm going to be helping my learners with. By the way, when we talk about engaging courses and so on, and completion rates, etc., if we are teaching adults, right, this much more motivating, right, to say, okay, if you finish this course, you get these skills that have this clear career pathway, rather than, oh, here's some drag and drop, right, to, keep you more entertained as you take the course. It's like, okay, well, we're adults, right? So the drag and drop, is less motivating than you learn this, you give me, some hours of your time, I'm going to give you these skills, you can take these skills. Okay, then the last point is the incentives behind skills from the employer standpoint. Okay, so from the employer standpoint, who says, all right, in my organization, and if I'm a university offering a learning program for an external company, then the question is, from the company standpoint, who of my workforce, my student audience, has these skills, right? So if you as a company have, learners going through a learning platform, right, acquiring these skills and so on, then you want to then later on be able to see, okay, who has earned these skills, right? Who among my student base is adept at, feature engineering in AI? Okay, so skills as a whole really just cut down on some of the nonsense, right? That is in the form of intangible benefits from taking a course or a program, right? Ultimately, it's career advancement. That's kind of what we're in for. Now, so if we see, let's say, a learning system, then we carry that idea here from the beginning, right? Because the point is to say, all right, this is what my pathways are, my courses and my programs, and this is what my, other pieces of content are. But really what I have to do as a learner is advance my career, right? So anything that is in the form of credentials, ideally listed for skills, is that much better, right? Because you effectively are building a resume, much like GitHub does for engineers, where an employer can go and say, okay, well, what code do you know how to write? Right here, it's, okay, not what courses have you taken, because then you're making me think about what skills those taught you, but instead, what skills have you earned? Okay, so if we now go from the standpoint of the administrators, then orienting all of our progress and all of the learning activity towards skills gives us a much better view, especially if we are trying to, let's say if we are a university and we are doing a program for a corporation, okay, and we want to see as a university the performance of the employees in the corporation. Okay, so ultimately that's going to come down from the corporation standpoint to how well are you educating my workforce and how well are you conveying that you're educating my workforce. Therefore, skills, therefore, analytics about this. So now we say, okay, if we buy into the idea of skills, right, that skills are interesting and that we want to align our platforms as much as possible with the career advancement of the users, then we now go towards, okay, what data do we have, right? What data do we have about this? Because what we're going to do first is we're going to gather data about the students, we're going to gather data about the content, and then we're going to match it up, right? And that's really kind of what this entire talk and all of this work is about. So first you start by saying, okay, so as a student, what are you interested in? Okay, what are you interested in terms ideally of skills? It's like, what skills are you here to learn, or what job are you here to prepare for? And a job is really just, a collection of skills. Okay, so if you're building, let's say, a catalog, right, or of AI courses, well, it's great. You can just, have hundreds of courses here, but for someone who's coming in, it would be very helpful to see, okay, if I want to be a junior deep learning engineer, this is what I have to know. If I want to be a senior, this is what I have to know, etc. Right? And there are skills, right? And it's like, okay, if you want to be a junior deep learning engineer, then you need to know, you need to know stats, you need to know Python, you need to know what feature engineering is, just a collection of skills. And you as a learner, when you come in, you can say, okay, well, what skills do I want to get, right? And the idea is that the learner will, right away sort of convey this to the platform, right? And you can either say, okay, well, I have this skill in Python and it's self-reported. Okay, right? And because when we gather skills, we can distinguish between what is self-reported and what is granted by, let's say, what did a manager say that I know, or an instructor, or what do we surmise from courses? So first, as a learner, you just say, okay, well, what skills are you interested in, right? What jobs are you interested in? Because what we're doing here is we're populating what we know about the learner. You see in most systems right now, this is not really known, right? It's like you have a course catalog, learner signs up, walks in, and they can just go find stuff in the catalog. I mean, okay, that's fine, but you as the platform owner have no idea, right, about what are these skills or what are these courses that you should be recommending based on the learner's stated career objectives. So you just ask, right? And it's common to say, okay, well, what skills do you want to get, or what job do you want to get? Okay, if you know the job, then we can tell you, what skills, because these are ultimately, the data has to be populated, but it's pretty clear what skills are needed for each job if you're an expert in that job. So that's one, right? You just ask the learner, okay, what skills and what jobs are you interested in? Okay, then we go to the next piece, and this is where obviously edX is great, right? Which is the learner analytics, which effectively means gathering a time series event for almost anything that happens on the platform. Okay, so you watch a video, okay, a little event gets generated, and that event has a timestamp about the context of the user and about the context of the piece of content. You complete a multiple choice problem. It's like, okay, well, that also goes there. You enroll in something, okay, you look for a transcript, you are enrolled in something. All of that is what edX is generating constantly about the learners, right? Nothing intrusive here, but it's everything about the learner's behavior and the learner's performance. One piece of data that is generally interesting as well is to also gather the number of seconds that a learner is on each page, right? Which is maybe more feasible or not, depending on the scale with which we're operating. But if you can know learners are spending these many seconds in these pages versus these others, then you can also draw basically heat maps and so on about the learner's journey. But that's the second piece, right? It's the learner analytics, okay? And learner analytics, effectively, behavior and performance are probably the most important ones, but there's also enrollment, and this is, in edX by default. Now, to this, of course, you sum up what we had from before, right? So now we know this learner's stated skills, desired jobs, as well as their performance in the course, as well, and their behavior in the course. Okay, so now we're populating the picture a little bit more. Then we're going to go to something else, right? Which is, a big problem in education and AI in education and so on, and kind of why maybe as an industry we're a little bit behind others, is that there's just not a lot of data, right? Like in education, you can't really, when you're building AI models for courses, it's very difficult to say, I'm going to determine patterns based on traffic in the course, because even in the most popular courses, you're going to have, thousands of users. Let's just say on a per course basis, right? You're going to have thousands of users. So, well, that's still not going to be nearly enough of data for what you would need to draw patterns out of that behavior. And you're not going to say, okay, well, I'm going to have my first 30,000 students just going in here, no AI for them. I'm going to watch their behavior. And then on the, next batch, I'm going to start to apply patterns. Like, that's not going to work, right? Because just business-wise, it's not really feasible. If we stick with sort of the traditional means, then there's not enough data, okay? Because that's just how it is. So one thing that we like to do, right, to gather more learning analytics, as well as more analytics about the content itself, is to say, okay, well, let's have metadata at the unit level. Okay? Right now, we always have metadata at the course level, right? So we always know what subject a course teaches. Maybe we know what tags. We know things about the course. Basically, what would go in a course about page is what we know, right? And if a learner goes through a single course and gets a certificate for that course, presumably, not so directly, but we can say that they have mastered whatever is in the course about, right? That's kind of the norm. That's kind of what we have right now. Not really enough, though. Instead, if you say, okay, so for every single unit in a course, I'm also going to have metadata, then let's say one example, right? So let's just say that you are in a unit, and you say, okay, so for a single unit, I'm going to tag it with the skills that this teaches, the prerequisite knowledge that this implements, right? The level of difficulty. I'm just going to put metadata at the unit level, okay? And that metadata at the unit level is going to just, from a platform standpoint, give us a lot more to work with, okay? Because you imagine a learner goes through a unit with no metadata. Okay, so at the end of that thing, you know that the learner went through a unit. Maybe if the unit has a problem, you have that data point as well. If the learner has a video, if the unit has a video, you know the learner watched the video. That's it. If instead you go through a unit with metadata, right? If you know that there's a unit that is teaching, let's say, 3 skills, right? And it's implementing background, let's just say in this AI example, right? This unit is teaching, let's say, feature engineering, right? And it's implementing a background in linear algebra and in Python. At the end of that learner's journey through the unit, you can see that the learner has just a little bit advanced in his Python skill, okay? And they've implemented a little bit their background in linear algebra. Now, if you've entered 7 pieces of metadata for a unit, let's just say you can enter way more. The other problem here is how annoying do we want to be to instructors, and that's also where the AI comes in. But if the learner goes through a unit with 7 pieces of metadata, then you now have multiplied the data that you gather in your platform by a massive factor, right? You're no longer gathering just 1 data point for a unit. Now you're gathering 7, okay? So that's kind of what we like to do, right? We want to gather this data. There's another side effect or another bonus here of gathering metadata at the unit level, which is effectively, if you have, let's say let's just say the example of 7 pieces of data about a single unit, then that unit can be thought of as a point in a vector space, right? You imagine a 7D vector space, and that unit is a point in there, somewhere in that 7D vector space, okay? If you gather 8 pieces of data, then the 8D vector space is what we deal with. The point is, if you now have every unit in your courses tagged somewhere in that vector plane, well, then you can think of the distance between 2 units across any axis, okay? So if you, for example, tag, let's say, the level of difficulty and the level of, and some skill. Let's just say you had 1 unit that teaches Python Advanced, 1 unit that teaches Python Intermediate. So if you're in the Python Advanced unit and you get it wrong, and you want to say, okay, well, I want to find just one that's a little bit easier, then you hold the Python skill constant in that vector plane, and you glide down to difficulty, intermediate. Point is, you have now mapped all of your units. You have got enough unit level metadata to create a vector space where all the units are plotted there. Okay? So that's the other piece. Okay, so far, we've said, okay, there is the we're asking the learner for what are you interested in from a careers and occupation standpoint. Okay? And maybe we can, there's a next phase of the platform where we can just, do the jobs report, and then we tell the learners, okay, this is what you're interested in, congratulations. But let's just say we ask the learner what they're interested in. Okay, we know what the learner analytics are, right? And that's, great in edX, right? Because you have the behavior and the performance, especially. And now we have metadata about the units. Okay, so right away, we've multiplied by a massive factor the amount of data that we have on the system. Okay? So, and you say, okay, so now what can we do with this? Okay? And one thing is, well, you can start to recommend content much more granularly. Okay? If you look at this design, right? This design effectively has on the left a little bit of a traditional sort of course structure, right? Kind of generally what we find in edX, right? You have a fully fledged course where you're getting, you're taught in entire concepts, right, throughout the course of a course. On the right, you see that there is something that's a little bit more sort of YouTube-esque, okay? And the YouTube-esque is, the point of this is to not only recommend massive things, but it's like YouTube, right, to recommend very granular pieces of content, okay? We did this because over time, we saw that we were losing a lot of traffic to just YouTube, okay? Because sometimes the courses are very nice if you don't know anything at all, right? And you have to even learn what you need to learn. Other times, if you just want to learn something very specific, well, YouTube is better, right? So we say, okay, so let's kind of combine both concepts, right? The concept of a YouTube, right, with the concept of a traditional course. So now, okay, if you're going to do something like that, you need to have this data, right? You need to have this content level metadata. Otherwise, how are you going to get these granular recommendations? And if you know, by the way, what skills a unit teaches, let's just say this unit about the video element, if you know what skills that teaches, then you can also find throughout the rest of your platform what other pieces, what other units across the ecosystem, because we talked about this vector space, like the units are there, what other units cover that skill, okay? So once you have that, all right, pretty easy to get a link, right? And that's kind of what the stuff on the right is. Then, of course, you can, go back to your catalogs, right? And now you have this data, so you can do a much better job, recommending things to the users, right? You no longer have a catalog that is just based on, plastering courses in there. It's about this, right? So we should talk about so where does the AI come in? Okay, so for AI, first, we need a lot of data, a lot more data than we have right now. So that's kind of what all of this work covered up to this point. So where does the AI come in? Sorry, so when we talk about labeling units with metadata, maybe that's great, right, from an engineering standpoint, but you go practically to an instructor at a university or a company, and they're like, okay, no, thank you. That's going to be a lot more work, very annoying, right? Especially if you say, hey, can you gather, 20 data points instead of just 5, right? Because the more, the better for us. Okay, but that's going to be very annoying. So instead, this is where AI, comes in, right? Basically models to associate chunks of text, right, with skills, right, out of predetermined sets. Okay, so that's one piece. The other one is from the analytics standpoint, if we have gathered all of the learner data in a time series manner, right? Time series means that you don't only know how many, let's talk about the time spent example, right? You don't only know how many seconds the learner has spent on the platform as a whole, you know how much time they spend on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday, right? So then you can maybe predict Friday. And you can say, okay, well, what are the models for that? Okay, anything as simple as a regression to an LSTM or anything like that, right? That basically models oriented around extrapolating and predicting from time series data points. Okay, so this is one. And you could say, okay, well, for my vision of the platform, I want to take a special look at these certain performance and these behavioral metrics. Maybe I don't really care about the videos completed, but in my assessments, that's what I care about. So that is how, you can say, based on where you are as a learner and the time series data that we have for you, we are going to predict when you're going to maybe not be so engaged anymore, or we predict if you're going to fail, right? And as long as this approach is sufficiently flexible, then we can adapt to different models, right? Because obviously learners, like a university learner who's doing a bachelor's doesn't have the same requirements as, some developer marketing student. So that's kind of where this comes in. And then, of course, we can display this back to the end user, right? So whether it's something like, oh, you're going to fail or you're going to become disengaged, or just, descriptive metrics about where they are, it's like, well, that's feasible as well. So really, that is, that's another benefit. And then, we have other things like chatbots and learner support, right? For example, if we want to have, throughout the, I don't know who said, right, that online learning, sometimes it's a little bit difficult because learners don't have the direct support, but someone said that if there was a one-to-one teacher-to-student ratio, which obviously is not feasible across, the entirety of online education, because you're not going to have, 300,000 instructors, right, for some courses, but if there's a one-to-one teacher-to-student ratio, then you should effectively bridge that gap a lot more, right? And chatbots are, obviously one means for that. We saw, yesterday there was a talk, obviously, about Watson, right, where, you feed chatbots with frequently asked questions, right, and you can go through the contents of your course and just, train a Watson bot to do this. Okay, there are also other models that are natural language, etc., like GPT-3 and other variations of that are, in my opinion, a lot cooler. But that's kind of where we put all of this together, right? So to summarize, if we have content metadata at the unit level, okay, not just at the course level, if we have content metadata at the unit level, we know what skills a learner is interested in, what jobs a learner is interested in, and we have their day-to-day behavior and performance analytics in a time series way, which allows us to predict, then we effectively can put all this together and go back to the, to the end users, right? The learners, the educators, and the employers, and say, okay, this is how we're gonna have a platform that is skills oriented, right, and towards the career advancement. So basically that's it, and it's the end of the day, right? So at some point I should, shut up. Yes.
How are you using crowdsourcing? I feel like crowdsourcing is the perfect solution to gathering metadata. And I guess my other question is, if you do have that metadata and you are able to sequentially match courses via that metadata by holding certain, certain of that metadata constant, like you were saying, how can you guarantee that you're not, like, let's say you use a LSTM or some sequence to sequence or something like that. How can you guarantee that you're not going to have basically just reforming degrees and instead actually be focusing on, you're struggling with this one problem, let's find you something that will help you solve this problem by solving an easier problem. So how can you guarantee that without, I guess algorithmically?
Yeah. So I mean, and the thing with the crowdsourcing, that's kind of where this all starts, because you could ask the students, but the problem is that if we kind of go too hard on the crowdsourcing, then the data labeling is not going to be uniform, right? So generally, even though all the conversations, because ideally you think of, okay, let's have a crowdsourcing system because then you get network effects, right? The producers and consumers, and that's great. But the problem with that is obviously you don't have the authority from someone higher up saying this is the metadata that is eligible for this, right? So in practice, whenever we have crowdsourcing, it's generally people who have come together already in some way, let's say maybe the instructors of a given organization, who have been given a list of skills or a list of standards to choose from, right? And it's not, you see how the other slide had this free text field. It's like, okay, well, in reality, this free text field is going to be an autocomplete out of a list of available skills, right? Even when we have the AI and we're using, we're passing a blob of text as well as a list of skills, we're already passing the list of skills because we don't want anything to be now labeled as a skill, right? So the crowdsourcing is a little dicey from that reason, because there needs to be at some point some sort of authority that says, okay, within these parameters, now we do the crowdsourcing. And that is generally what drives the second question as well, right? So when you label something, if we are, let's say, doing this for some adaptive content solution, right, where we want to suggest something that is just maybe marginally easier, we don't have that problem because we don't have the crowdsourcing field completely open, right? And it's ultimately, we don't want to be a pain to the instructors, right? Because in theory, if you have the same instructors or let's say the same instructor, right, that would be totally uniform. Okay, well, that's not wieldy. So then you have many instructors. Okay, that's still very annoying. So now you have an AI that is suggesting, it's like, hey, this skill seems relevant to this. Do you want to just say, yes, this is relevant? And that's much easier. But the point is that there is not total crowdsourcing for that reason, because otherwise you need, I don't know, I mean, you look at the problem of, let's say, like a Reddit or something like that, right? If we can start to gather much more data about the content, so let's just say if in each unit you have a thumbs up or a thumbs down, okay, because the user, you're not going to burden the student with populating, 1 star out of 10, right? So you just say thumbs up and thumbs down. Okay, so now I got a lot more data. I was not too annoying to anybody, but I'm going to take that input already into the algorithm. So generally what we're trying to do is, it's a little bit annoying, right? But it's, on one hand, trying to max out the data that we can have with another variable, which is the quality of the data that is being placed here, because otherwise you get to the debris scenario, with the not being incredibly annoying for instructors, because we've seen that that's how many AI and education solutions have failed. All right, you have companies that say, oh, I have this great AI, but then in practice, it doesn't get used because you're just giving the instructors an insane amount of work. It's like, hey, don't create 3 problems, create 85. And okay, well, sorry. Right, so it's generally it's a balance there, and we try to keep it flexible because now this is just practically speaking, but if we're in an organization where there is buy-in from like the heads of learning to do something like this, where now you don't only depend on, the the free willingness of the instructors, then we can go a little bit harder on requesting more data. But if not, then if we requested none of these bounds, debris. If we request a lot, not going to be used. So somewhere in the middle, and that depends.
Hi.
Hey, what's up? How are you?
Great. So thanks for very interesting talk. So continuing the last question, so there's the data that you get behind the scenes, right? Learners' behavior while learning, the data you get from the instructors, but there's also data that you ask the learner, like which jobs are interesting and which skills, etc. Based on your experience, is that something that learners are engaged with, or is it something like they like just to skip and start learning?
I mean, it's more skip than start learning, because okay, so there's basically to answer that, it's more skip than start learning. But in some platforms, what we started to do is also show learners this is what's feasible, right? Because many will automatically filter themselves out of a certain job. They'll be, well, I don't really have the skills for that, or that would seem too long, or that's too complicated, right? So many will not select that. But if you say, let's say one example, let's say you're good at cybersecurity and you want to go to deep learning. Okay, if you don't have this talk about skills, if you just have, let's say, cybersecurity credentials, you look at deep learning and you're like, I don't really know anything about that. But if you've broken down your cybersecurity knowledge in terms of the actual skills that it taught, it's good. So now you know some DevOps, at least, you know Python, right? You know a bunch of stuff that are already a starting skill for deep learning. So what we like to do is say, okay, if you are a professional in this field and you have these skills, then this is how close you are to another kind of job. So now maybe, whereas beforehand you wouldn't have populated deep learning into that search box because you think it's too hard, now you say, okay, well, you're already, 13% of the way there, right? So that is, and it also depends on the audience, right? There are some people who are, or some platforms where, especially if it's a company educating an audience, usually there's less emphasis on the what career do you want to get, because the underlying message behind a company doing these courses is buy my stuff, which is fine, right? But that's kind of how we try to do that, is we break the programs and the jobs up into skills. If you have skills in one field, you're actually not as unprepared for other fields as previously thought, so that helps.
You were talking about the skills that you say you can define it on a unit level. But now, normally we design courses on subject matter with learning objective over an entire course. So if you now know it per unit, are you then also going to investigate, like, if the possibilities are a learner comes in, they say, I need to have a certain skill set, and that means like it can come from 10 different courses because they need to have a certain skill in for example, Python programming, but they're lacking like a basic knowledge on DevOps, and then in other topics they need to have an advanced level that will be from other courses.
Yeah, that's true. So then you have to say, okay, so when we search, first, there's an argument to say this unit level metadata, we can either put it in the search or we cannot put it in the search for the global course, right? So when we have the global search box for the entire catalog where the output is just courses, not units, there is an argument for not putting this unit level metadata in there, right? So then if you want to learn Python, we're not going to look at the unit level metadata, so that's where we were before, right? But ideally, we put this in the global search because now when you do a global search, you're also going to get specific units, right? So let's just say if you want to learn Python, all right? And there is a Python course, there's a deep learning course that teaches Python, and then there's a cybersecurity course that teaches Python, right? In your example, you would want just the Python course first, and then the other two, deep learning and cybersecurity, maybe it's whatever, right? So then the search algorithm, right, and here, right, Elasticsearch in edX, we'd have to say, okay, how do we rank the course level metadata to be much more important than the unit level metadata? So basically, you still control kind of the path where the learner is going to go.
It's also more about then, it can be the case that from a basic course, you're only lacking one specific skill, so that you only need to have a certain part in that course. Can be in one unit, can be an entire subsection, or talking about edX terminology. So in that case, basically, it's like, if you can be able as a learner to select skills, then you can also say, like, you build your own course based on AI.
That's true. So if you have had if the instructors, I mean, and this is great, if the instructors create the pieces of, you know how some instructors, they create courses, they say, oh, as we saw in the last section, right? It's like, if you have instructors that are creating kind of, linear paths like that, then it's more difficult. But if you have instructors who create truly modular content, right? So when you watch a video, there's no one saying, oh, as we saw in the last section, no, because you don't know where the learner comes from, then yeah, I think that's perfect. And also at the end of the course, let's say you take this Python course. So at the end of the course, instead of just saying, okay, you've learned Python, congratulations, now you say, okay, you've learned Python, congratulations. You're 80% good at objects, 90% good at functions, 50% good at decorators, right? And you can give a much more granular breakdown of what you have learned in that field. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, a lot of this depends. We have sort of these tools and the AI and the data and so on, but a lot of it depends on the humans sort of running the program, right? The instructional designers and the professors and so on, to make sure that things are not labeled in the debris way, right? And that there is some sort of standard at least.
Question.
Oh, yes.
I'm curious, when we were talking about tagging and kind of the strain it puts on the instructors, have you considered passing the course content, whether that's transcripts or the actual content of the course and just using AI and not having to have a person involved at all in order to get some of those skills tagging if you already have the skills taxonomy set up?
Yeah. So yes. And what this would be is effectively what we suggest to the instructors, like, hey, does this course teach this skill? We use AI to surmise, to guess that. Right? And the AI is generally, there are the global vector models where you look at the entirety of a text. So that can be the transcript of a video in a unit, right? Or just the HTML of the text, and models that take into account the entire context. Like if you say, is the word Python closer to snake or to programming? Well, you're gonna have to look at the rest of the blob to know that, right? And those are the models that we would use. So we pass in the blob of text, we pass in available skills, right? And those are maybe skills that we've decided from a marketing standpoint that the platform or the course is supposed to teach. And we say, okay, AI, tell me what of these skills is relevant to this piece of text. And it could be ranked, right? It could be like, okay, well, I'm 60% sure it's this skill, 40% sure it's this one, and 15% sure it's that one. But that's kind of how we would do that, yeah. So the AI is supposed to minimize the annoyance. And we just run it by the instructors after. But if we don't want to, then we can say, okay, the instructors, we're not even going to run it by you, and we're just going to attack it behind the scenes. I mean, maybe that's better, right? Ultimately, it's just, okay, how much human control is there over the outcome? So what we choose to say is, okay, the instructor gets the final word. We minimize the annoyance, but it's a lot easier for the instructor to say yes, 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 rather than to think about it from scratch.
I'm a bit curious, how are you dealing with the career path models? So from, as an example, one company going from a junior developer or a DevOps engineer to a senior one, different skills are required. Are you working with individual companies to kind of create that model for the career path, or how are you handling that?
So, I mean, generally, everything that we do is on-premise, right? Or even if it's hosted, the databases are generally separate, right? So the good news is that we don't have to compromise from one company's, junior DevOps to another company's senior DevOps. Instead, every company has, sort of their own standards, right? So if you say senior DevOps, you need these 5 skills, junior DevOps, you need 1 skill, then all of the trajectory is from within the company. So this would be more difficult if we had to regulate, right? Because maybe Tesla saying that you're good at something is different than, I don't know, some other organization. So we just try to keep it within each company.
Research groups that edX is using very similar model here, where we're trying to map skills to jobs, and there's companies that do that already, and so we plug into those in order to figure out, based on job postings, what does a senior engineer need from a skill standpoint, and then map that back to courses. We should chat.
Awesome. Yeah.
The questions? All right. We're just at time, so thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Miguel.
Thank you. Okay. Okay.